This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Hindu's In Focus podcast. I'm Zubaida Hamid, your host for today. The devastating landslides in Wayanad that left over 400 dead and over 100 still missing shocked not just Kerala but the entire country. Almost immediately, a blame game began. Union Home Minister Amit Shah said that adequate warning had been given to Kerala, but the government of Kerala disputed this. It said that the warning came after the landslides had occurred. Experts in the meantime have pointed to a number of factors that could have acted as the trigger, including the 570 millimeters of rainfall received in the region over 2 days on July 30th and 31st. The tragedy has also brought back into the news the Western Ghats Ecology expert panel led by Madhav Gadgil, whose report in 2011 recommended that the entire region of the Western Ghats, 129,000 square kilometers across 6 states, be declared an ecologically sensitive zone. The report recommended 3 zones for specific ecologically sensitive areas with strict restrictions on development activities in the first 2. This report generated backlash from the states as it would significantly impact livelihoods and economic growth. Following the landslide, the central government brought out for the 6th time in 10 years a draft notification again classifying parts of the Western Ghats as ecologically sensitive areas, and now concerns of the states are said to be addressed by a separate committee. So what were the actual triggers of the landslide? How are the Western Ghats and other hilly regions in India particularly vulnerable? How much of a role has climate change played, and will this continue in the near future? What can be done to make modelling and prediction systems better? We dive into these questions and more with Raghu Murthugude, a professor of climate studies at IIT Bombay and an emeritus professor, University of Maryland. Welcome to the Hindus in Focus podcast, Professor Raghu Murthugude.
Thank you. Nice to talk to you. I guess we are on the podcast.
Professor, let's start with going into how this landslide, the Wayanad landslide, happened. We know that more than 570 mm of rainfall was received on 30th and 31st July in the area, and this is said to be the trigger for the landslide. Could you explain to us how it happened?
So, as you said, rainfall, of course, is the biggest ingredient, even though sometimes you can have other causes. Let's say you have a road and some big event happens on the road and you can cause landslides because these slopes can be unstable. But when you have such an amount of rain, it's not always easy to say if this is enough rain to cause a landslide because these conditions are built up over time. And what we know is that Wayanad is a very beautiful touristic place, which means it would have had some development happening over the years to host the tourists that come in. It's a beautiful land of coffee and tea plantations, but there is also mixed in some rubber plantations. So let's say the slopes were loosened up a little bit by all the human activities, because 2 things to remember is that now everything is happening in a warmer world, so all weather events have a contribution from global warming, and all regions have been touched by human activities, so our impact is there on everything that happens. So in that context, basically the rainfall created the landslides. The surprising thing I saw is that it happened in multiple places down the mountain. It's not just one big landslide. It seems like at least 3 that I saw. So this is unusual in the sense maybe the first landslide impacted the nearby region and created the next one and so on. So that's a bit unusual.
Let's get into what you just talked about, unchecked human activity, basically. I want to talk a little bit about the Gadgil report of 2011, which has been in the news again post this disaster, which said that the entire region in the Western Ghats, 129,000 square kilometers across 6 states, should be declared as ecologically sensitive. We know that this report got a lot of backlash, it wasn't implemented, and neither was another subsequent report by K. Kasturi Rangan and his panel. Tell us a little bit about these reports, what they said, and in the context of the present tragedy.
Yes, so looking at it in a slightly different way, yes, you can identify ecologically sensitive regions because this is one of the 3 hottest biodiversity spots. So from that perspective, you want to protect it, birds, plants, various exotic plants, exotic species of lizards, frogs, etc., snakes, and so on. And you have to also be careful about the words we use. Like you said, unchecked human development. What does it mean? This tells you the scale of things we have to worry about. So if you declare the entire Western Ghats as a sensitive region, let's say, and government takes this report seriously and says there will be zero development on the Western Ghats for the entire length and breadth of it, and people who are living there will be allowed to continue. Let's say there are some tribes or other people who have been living there for centuries before human activities became so prominent, and they will be allowed to live in harmony with the forests and so on. Then what happens? The risk is never zero. We have to realize that global warming is happening, and these heavy rains are in fact being forced from far away. So, for example, the Pacific El Nino happens around Galapagos, which is thousands of kilometers away. That can create problems for rains in the Western Ghats. Middle East is warming, which is closer, and we know that that's affecting heavy rainfall. And coastal warming affects the heavy rainfall, which is a natural phenomenon. So when you make such, reports and you give it to the government has to really decide where it's going to do what. So if you said Wayanad is very sensitive and that's where you have to focus your action, then it becomes very specific. But if you say entire Western Ghats have to be protected, then you need another panel to look at it and say what exactly is needed at this point. Is it possible to stop all development and prevent people from enjoying the Western Ghats completely and just keep it protected? Or is there a more intelligent way of being very local in estimating the risks and work on the most risky places in terms of landslides? So when forcing is coming from outside and you have to do something to prevent these things, it takes much more than a report that says entire Western Ghats is sensitive.
Let's get into a little bit about what you said in terms of external climate change factors that are impacting our areas. You have previously written about the drivers of extreme climate events, such as this originating far away, and you just mentioned, but these could be enhanced by specific local factors. And you also mentioned, of course, rising sea surface temperatures. Could you explain this to us?
So the Indian Ocean is a special place. So first thing is you said global warming, climate change. So human beings have been burning fossil fuels. Let's say we go back to the Industrial Revolution, and you can also go back all the way to when we started agriculture and deforesting the planet and so on. But at some point we started ramping up the greenhouse gases, and something like carbon dioxide accumulates in the atmosphere because once you put it in into the atmosphere, it doesn't go away. It doesn't. Some goes into the ocean, some goes into plants, but some remains in the atmosphere and it begins to build up. So we've been warming the climate, but these patterns are not always uniform. So some regions warm more and some regions warm less, and there are reasons why that happens, climate dynamics and so on. So Middle East, for example, is warming very fast, and the Mediterranean is warming very fast. These are dry regions. They have to respond to global warming in a certain way, and they do. And Indian Ocean is very unique because it gets some heat from the Pacific Ocean. It gets some heat from the Southern Ocean. These are called ocean tunnels. So we are under the surface, we are getting some heat into the Indian Ocean. And Indian Ocean is also special because of the monsoon circulation. Altogether, Indian Ocean is warming, but it's not warming uniformly everywhere. Because of the Middle East warming, the winds shift over the Arabian Sea, so the Arabian Sea warms more, and that begins to have specifically more impacts on the Western Ghats of India and also Northwest India into Pakistan. For example, we don't pay much attention to Pakistan. Pakistan has been flooding every year since 2010. This is part of our system. And then there are, of course, other natural variabilities like El Nino and La Nina. And when you combine these, for example, 2023-24, 2023 was one of the warmest years on record by now. And it's because global warming combined with El Nino. El Nino is like a mini global warming because it puts out the heat from the ocean that's been accumulating over a few years. And then this warming was even more than global warming plus El Nino because underwater a volcano went off Hangatunga in 2022, which put up a lot of water vapor into the atmosphere. And water vapor is a very strong greenhouse gas. So you have these kind of factors combining and creating havoc once in a while. But you have the background global warming going on now, and the patterns matter because specific impacts to us come from natural modes like El Nino and warming like the Middle East warming. So, how to track all these things for specific local factors? So, what I call them is global drivers and local amplifiers. So, right now we are hearing about cloudbursts in the Himalayan foothills. So you have global warming, you have monsoon going on, and monsoon is a normal phenomenon, natural variability, but then you have slopes. So when you combine warm air, a lot of moisture with the slopes, you get cloudbursts. So then you have to worry about whether cloudbursts are increasing and then whether they are affecting regions where people have been living for a long time on the slopes. And now suddenly we see that they are very vulnerable to such heavy cloudbursts. So this is a very complicated problem.
Specifically, how is it impacting the Western Ghats? You said that all of this. How does it play into the factors that make the Western Ghats vulnerable? And do you see this increasing over the next few years?
Western Ghats is a bit of a complicated story because if you look carefully at the last few decades, actually, I mentioned Middle East warming and the wind shifting northward, which has increased heavy rain over northern parts of the Western Ghats into northwest India and Pakistan. So Kerala has actually been having reducing total seasonal rainfall over a couple of decades, let's say, okay? And the problem is not so much anymore how much it rains, it is how it rains. If you are getting the monsoon from June to September and you are getting, let's say, even less amount of rain over this period, but that rain is coming in very few days, then you are really creating very heavy impact. And that's what is the problem with Western Ghats is that, of course, they are slopes and there is human perturbation going on, but we are producing heavy rain from remote impacts as well. So it's a combination of things that makes Western Ghats very vulnerable, like the Himalayan foothills. Any mountain slopes are very vulnerable anywhere you are to heavy rain. And for centuries, if you've been doing something and living happily and building touristic places, building roads and bridges and so on and so forth, suddenly rainfall begins to go up, then you are not prepared for it. So the best strategy always is to build back better. Now that Wayanad has been hammered so badly, how long will this attention last and what lasting changes will we make in terms of building resilience into the infrastructure, getting people to respond to these events? Because there is evidence already that people listen to climate change impacts on these events. After 3 years, they forget. So these are the kind of issues that Western Ghats specifically faces. Of course, it's also a biodiversity hotspot, which we want to protect. There are a lot of medicines and animal species and reptiles, birds, and so on that I mentioned. So it's a nice long range of mountains. It's a treasure. You want to preserve it. But the question is, how can we produce very, very local information to make specific actions? Because all global warming is local. Just saying global warming has no meaning. Locally in your backyard, what happens? And you cannot just say Western Ghats. You have to say specifically all regions of Western Ghats. Literally every meter of the Western Ghats, we need a risk map to say what actions will be needed.
Talk to us a little bit about mitigation factors. Following the Wayanad tragedy, the Hume Center for Ecology and Wildlife, that has been collecting granular data from Wayanad since 2018, they said that they had sent adequate warnings to the state and local administration. And other experts have also said that perhaps the government didn't do enough risk mitigation in this case. You talked a little bit about building resilience in these communities, very local, action specific measures to be taken. What are the ways in which this could have been done? Are there well defined protocols that we have, or do we need to come up with them?
Yeah, so as scientists, we are always ready with advice. We have to remember that the information we give may not always, we think it's useful, but is it usable? So let's say they gave very specific warnings, but what does that mean? Did they say Wayanad is vulnerable? Did they say this place of Wayanad, this section of Wayanad is vulnerable to how much rain? So that's one part. How local is the information? How specific is the information? The second part is we give advice, but let's say politicians have to make decisions, and they have their own rules of the games. They have to make decisions, and they pay a price in the elections. So it's easy to blame politicians, but actually they make decisions and they are responsible, whereas scientists often give advice and they are not responsible for anything. Just as a scientist, I myself always want to be aware of that. And sometimes we overestimate the value of science in making ultimate decisions, because there are many factors involved. There are developers who will be paying them to say, no, this is a very nice site, we can make a lot of money, and so on and so forth. Then there is monocropping and rubber plantations and so on, where people are making money. So it's not just big developers. Let's say there are plantation people. So everybody is involved in it. So pointing fingers is almost always the wrong way to go about it. So you want to co-produce solutions. You want scientists to actually work on the ground with people, and you want people to put pressure from bottom up on the politicians saying our lives are in danger. But people also have to always, realize that they may be jeopardizing their own lives with the decisions they make. So it's incentivizing the whole system and mitigating, you can say reduce deforestation and don't do rubber cropping. People are selling tea plantations maybe because warming is impacting the tea yields or tea quality and so on. So there are very, very complicated factors involved. So you have to map these things, and you can make a lot of mitigation type actions saying don't build roads on these slopes. There is geological analysis you can do to see which slopes are really vulnerable to heavy rain, let's say, and so on. But the biggest thing also is to make sure that building resilience means it's planning for the future. And that takes money, and that funding has to be sustained. So all these actions have to become part of the budgeting process. And then you have to decide who's responsible. Is Western Ghats a responsibility of the individual states, or is the central government going to say, we will manage this, and here is how we are going to fund you to build resilience? So these are very complicated issues. Simply starting from one end saying we gave advice is actually almost always misleading. And I find that a bit frustrating, because ultimately climate change at the last mile is a social problem, social science problem, socio-economic problem, and political problem. Our job is to provide hyper-local risk information. Are we doing the best job at it? Not yet. We make a lot of noise, but we need ourselves to go a long way in providing very useful and usable, actionable, it's called, and so on. That information is not really there yet.
Tell us a little bit about that. How do you understand hyperlocal factors better? Factors that affect climate crises.
Yeah, if you go back to Wayanad, you have a certain slope, you have a certain vegetation, you have people living there, and then you have landslide prediction is always very tricky, very difficult, but rainfall is better. Rainfall predictions, let's say, are made by IMD at something like 12-kilometer scale, and then we have ways of using artificial intelligence and machine learning and local data to what is called downscaling. So you can take the 12-kilometer information down to literally 1-kilometer level, let's say. And then you have to constantly keep doing that, and you have to have a background vulnerability. So risk is basically defined as a multiplier of hazard, where heavy rain is the hazard in this case, vulnerability, which will include the slopes and the soil and various other factors, and exposure is mostly to people, but in this case it's, let's say, exposure of the Western Ghats to heavy rain. So some factors will be involved there. These are quantifiable metrics. So you want to have a good map of vulnerability and exposure, so that you can make many scenarios of hazards. If it rains 300 millimeter in 24 hours, what will happen? If it rains 500 millimeter, will this be always perfect information? No, but it will give you a very good lead, very good leg up on being prepared as best as you can. So if the forecast comes in saying this monsoon will be heavier because we have a La Nina happening. Then you have to prepare all these vulnerable places for such disasters. And then comes some forecast that says 2 to 4 weeks ahead, we're expecting very active monsoon. That prepares your system to be ready with equipment and personnel. And then next 3-4 days, you will get some information saying very heavy rain is expected because the coast is warming and this generally produces very heavy rain. Then you put people in the most vulnerable places in terms of disaster management. So disaster management, recovery, and so on are something that you have to go in this direction at hyper-local scales, remembering always that risk is never zero, and protecting every place with this kind of approach is not possible because it takes enormous resources, but you want to maximize your resources to protect the most vulnerable places and people.
You spoke to us a little bit earlier about how it's not the amount of rainfall that you get over the entire monsoon period of June to September that matters, but even if there is a deficit overall, sometimes it's the amount of rainfall you get during one heavy period that can cause a crisis such as this. The southwest monsoon has been getting more intense over the years, cloudbursts are getting more frequent. Do you see this continuing over the next few years across various parts of the country?
Well, just like the total rain is not so important as how it rains, the frequency, duration, intensity, it's also important to see where it's raining more because you cannot rain more everywhere. You will take the moisture away from somewhere. So some places will be getting drier. So yes, with Middle East warming, certain places are becoming more vulnerable, but we also showed that the general extreme rainfall over India is kind of stuck to a corridor that is running from Odisha, West Bengal, and Andhra towards Gujarat, Rajasthan, and so on. We have to understand why that is, but there are some ideas as to why it gets stuck there. And then you are combining the Middle East warming, shifting in winds, Arabian Sea, that is producing more rain over Northwest. And then you have more pre-monsoon rainfall over Kerala. So again, it's not just about whether it will increase. The question is where will it increase? Will it increase in the pre-monsoon or the monsoon? And now every year we are having deficit rainfall in the season over Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, parts of Uttar Pradesh, Odisha, and so on. And suddenly in October they will get heavy rain. And is that northeast monsoon or is that still southwest monsoon? So even the two monsoons are blurring their boundaries. So it's not just always about whether extremes are increasing and cloudbursts are increasing. It is where and when. So it's always, you have to always stay ahead because the standard argument that global warming will increase extreme rainfall, again, it comes down to hyper local information. In my backyard, what will happen? That's the question we have to answer.
Speaking about where, last year ISRO released the landslide atlas of India, marking Jammu and Kashmir, Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand, and what you talked about, the northeastern Himalayan ranges among the most vulnerable. As you pointed out to us, this means millions of people could potentially be at risk. Talk to us a little bit more about what other regions of India are also becoming vulnerable.
This again, as I said, we have to map because vulnerability it could be in terms of food and agriculture, it could be in terms of water, so it could be water access, quantity and quality, it could be in terms of energy. Are we going to keep serving energy through fossil fuels or are we going to put renewables? Then where will be the easiest to put solar and wind? It could be health. So many places are getting, even droughts can cause health problems because during a drought, there is very little water and people congregate to those water bodies and then you get some unique health issues as opposed to floods and health issues. Buildings are very vulnerable, depends on whether you are living on a mountain slope or in a flooding region or in a dry region. So transportation is a vulnerability for many people. If you are living in a big city like Mumbai and you have to rely on public transportation to go to work, then heavy rain comes, trains close, buses don't run, then you lose your income. So this is not a simple issue of where the vulnerability is increasing. It is, again, where the vulnerability is increasing in what way. Is it in terms of food availability, food production? Is it in terms of transportation, buildings? Is it health? Is it water? And so on and so forth. So we need to map all those things. So there's no blanket answer saying this place is, for example, heat waves are getting worse in some places in the pre-monsoon. But this again depends on how it is evolving. It used to be more intense in Telangana and Andhra, and it has slightly moved to the northwest again. So northwest is getting increasing heat waves. And heat waves again are duration, intensity, and frequency. So they combine. So when you have a La Nina, you get a different pattern of heat waves. When you have El Nino, you have different pattern of heat waves. And you have winter storms, less rain, less precipitation, more precipitation. It's a very complicated story. We need a detailed map of what kind of vulnerability in which region and how they are changing.
Let's go back a little bit specifically to Wayanad and specifically to the Western Ghats again. The central government has now reissued for the sixth time in 10 years the draft notification, which again classifies part of the Western Ghats as ecologically sensitive areas. Would you say that there's now an urgent need for states to arrive at a consensus on the report?
They can, but again, it needs a plan, action plan. So consensus in terms of what? So let's say all the states coordinate their actions, then they have to submit a list of information they need from, let's say, IMD or from National Disaster Management Agency, the funding they will need, how it will come, which ministry will be in charge. So the central government itself has to start thinking how to manage disasters. Climate forecast and so on, weather forecast are under the Ministry of Earth Science. We have a Ministry of Environment and Forests. We have a Ministry of Environment, I think. Some other ministries are there for land development and other things. So how do we work together at all levels, from central to state and from state to even literally at panchayat levels, because action has to be taken everywhere. So it's not just consensus. It's about mapping the action plan and a line of command. We have become very good at disaster management in many ways. And that is good, because even though people die in these kind of incidences, they are always a tragedy, but we have reduced the number of deaths and the recovery is faster. But this has a long way to go in terms of bringing in this early warning systems into managing the crisis. So you have to always think of it in two scales for consensus and action: is disaster management with early warnings at few days to few weeks and a season time scale, and resilience building with information for a decade. Who will do the decadal prediction information? We don't have a good plan yet. Everybody keeps doing projections to 2100, which are basically, I would say, worthless. What are we going to do with the information at that scale? So consensus has to then demand from the bottom up. You tell me next 10 years how I should prepare when I make, because all the development plans, roads, infrastructure, energy infrastructure, everything is about planning for, at least a decade. So consensus cannot be made based on some report. It needs tremendous action at so many levels. And climate scientists have to realize what their role is. Simply producing a report or using projections of 2100 to say something will happen in 2050, they are not very actionable information. So we all have to work together on this.
Thank you so much for speaking to us today, Professor.
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.